Welcome to Dice and Mind, a podcast hosted by Brad Brown and Jason Kaufman to explore the intersection of life, games, science, music, philosophy, and creativity through interviews with leading creatives. All are welcome in this space.
It actually, as this drops, breaking the fourth wall within 10 seconds of this episode,
Yep, well done.
we haven't done an intro-outro recording together in a couple weeks, I think.
At least.
Yeah. So it's good to be back doing this. So
It
as you
is.
listen tonight, outside of our special guest, you'll probably notice we're a little verbose just because there's lots to talk about.
Well, toward that end, let's just keep
Yeah,
peeling back the fourth wall for a sec, because it's an
yeah.
interesting thing, I think, to some of our listeners that over the past year, what not even, right? This calendar year, it would be more accurate to say that we have gotten in the habit ever since settling into a bi-weekly format, which works just ideally for us both these days.
Hmm.
That
Yes.
and it's allowing a little bit of time to game. Not a lot, but
Mhm.
a little bit. And that's
That's
been
that's impacted by me. If I had a little bit more time, we would be
right.
more heavy into it.
Right, but it's at least provided that opportunity, which is one of the reasons
Yes.
we went bi-weekly. But because of that, we almost invariably record an interview and then the following week record the rest of the episode.
And I
And yeah,
think
and it
and
works.
we do that in many cases just because after we're done, I think we tried doing the intro outros that same day or evening,
Eh,
but we have such great conversations with folks. We need to digest them.
This works better.
Yes.
It gives us whether it's a few days or a week, it gives us time to think about it, to talk about it, come back a little more fresh. And like you said, just the quirk of our recording schedule these past weeks, we haven't done this piece in a bit, which is good. I think we're both happy to be back behind our microphones because, like I've missed this because
Hmm.
this is the chance we have to talk about this stuff. We try to keep that out of the interview itself.
Yeah. And when you and we chat regularly during the week, we just tend to not get as deep into this stuff.
Right.
And I think we haven't really talked about it, but I think part of it is by keeping it fresh. We haven't out talked it. We haven't over talked it outside of recording. One and two, you know, this will elicit some humor, but we tend to, with some of the topics we bring up, we tend to surprise each other. We don't really
Yeah.
tell each other what we're going to talk about before we do.
Right.
So,
Right.
like for example, when we're done with the interview with our special guest here, we'll mention that in a second. We'll go over to Audubon Court, and we will really, you'll say, do you have something? I have got something, and
Right.
then we'll go, and we don't tell each other what we're going to talk about, and
Almost never,
that generates great banter.
because we want it to be a discussion.
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes.
So toward that end, who do we have for this episode? What's the plan, Brad?
So, um, I think I know I said during the interview that small dice and mind trivia. This guest is the person that introduced me to the idea of going back and looking at Traveler again.
Mm,
Um, but more importantly, he is the man behind CORE20,
yeah.
which is a phenomenal implementation of a D20 type game in a way that really there are components to it that just kind of feel real life, even if they are fantasy positions and roles and
Right.
duties and things. So
Now,
we
we are
have
not,
Scott Fitzgerald
I was
Gray
going to
tonight.
say, yes, we are,
Yes.
to be clear, everybody, we are not actually talking about Will Wheaton.
No.
Although, Will, if you're listening, we are willing to sell either of Brad's children to get you on the show.
Well, first of all, I could that could be negotiated. One and two, he's not listening.
He's not
So
listening. So, more importantly, back to Scott Fitzgerald Gray, who joined us the first time 21 episodes in 101.
yep.
21 episodes ago, and we knew at the time I'm blocking Brad. I think during the interview we probably said we have to have you back. But as you often do, but like after we hung up, as we typically do with our guests, we keep talking with them.
Yeah.
And it was like, man, we didn't. So, because we had him on really shortly after the whole situation with Wizards of the Coast and their change to the OGL. And Scott is and I mean this in the best possible way, Scott is a veteran
Hmm.
D&D and other writer. What D&D Pathfinder, he's been all over the place. He just ridiculously well accomplished. And so afterwards, he had some real insights. And of course, yet again, we didn't get to that, but that's okay. Because like you said, we really wanted to talk to him about CORE20, which is in beta and is nearing prime time, we hope.
And as you listen to this tonight, I would, you know, I would ask, listen to where you hear of the differences and how they implement, whether you want to call them careers, roles,
Hmm.
classes, whatever the case may be. Listen to that amongst everything else. But I think you'll find that
Yeah.
I'm suspecting our listeners are going to find that to be a very unique and cool way of creating player characters in the game and allowing them to grow. And if you think about it, that gives you lots and lots potentially. He talks about this. There's traditionally like a ceiling. I won't give anything else other way. There's a ceiling
Yeah.
for traditional
Yeah.
like D&D players, D&D characters and all that. I think this really has taken that away and there's a lot higher ceiling.
Yeah, he provides some really nice insight into not just the mechanics, but some of the core conceptual issues behind D&D and in general D20 based fantasy and high fantasy games and how it differentiates. I think we were both rather taken
Mhm.
by what he had to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Scott Fitzgerald Gray has been flogging his imagination professionally since deciding he wanted to be a writer and abandoning any hope of a real career in about the fourth grade. The time since has seen him indulge in educational forays in science, arts and film, and the bewildering variety of occupations that have driven his search for the secret of the human condition to include information systems specialist, multimedia developer, teacher, facilitator, journalist, production manager, editor, graphic designer, and logger, because he lives in Canada after all.
Scott, thanks for joining us again. Truly a pleasure having you last time. And
Mhm.
we're so happy that you were willing to join us this time. We got a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
Oh,
Um, and
yeah, very happy to be back. Thanks for the invitation.
absolutely.
so for those that might be new listeners, and believe it or not, we actually do have new listeners.
It seems that
Um,
way, yeah.
yeah. Um, we talked the last time about a new system that you're developing, CORE20.
Yeah.
I'm on the mailing list, so I get all of your updates and things, and so I'm kind of keeping abreast of it. But for
Mhm.
those that might be new, and this might be the first time they're hearing about CORE20, if you don't mind, let's go back a little bit and
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
about the genesis by which you started to develop this.
Sure. Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, Core 20, sort of in a nutshell, it's a version of D&D that I've always wanted to play. It's a version of D&D that has no classes and has no levels. It's built around freeform character building. When I first talked about moving towards a public playtest for the game, um, year before last, I explained at the outset that the part of the reason the game exists is because I'm extremely lazy. And if you go back to the original Genesis, my very first RPG was AD&D, first edition, back in 1981. And my second RPG was Traveler, and I loved both those games. Had huge fun with both of them. They
Here
were
we
they were
go.
absolutely yeah they were absolutely seminal to me. Um, but one of the big differences between the two of them, as anyone knows who's played it, is Traveler has no real character advancement rules, right? You build your character, and when your
Yeah.
character is ready to become a space hero, it's basically off you go, right? And there's no experience points. There are there are rules eventually. I don't think the little black books, I don't even think talked much about it. But I know in the Traveler book, the big omnibus edition, it got into, okay, if you want to improve your skills, you can you basically you can go to school to do that, right? It
Right.
was such a different approach to what AD&D was doing. And I loved what Traveler was doing. I loved AD&D, and I thought to myself back in 1981, wouldn't it be great if somebody wrote a version of D&D, like a cool fantasy game that also had no classes and no levels, where you basically just chose whatever you wanted to do, decided I want a little of this, a little of that. I'm going to study, in this branch of the military service or what have you. And I kind of waited patiently for someone else to do that game. And I waited a little bit longer, and then back in 2004, I actually started working in RPGs. I started working on D&D, and I was still waiting for someone else to do a version of D&D that didn't have that sort of had this setup. And when it became clear to me that nobody else was going to do it, I realized sort of in 2010-ish that I should probably just think about doing it myself.
Hmm.
And that was the original genesis of the game, was that point of just sort of wanting to see if it was possible, I guess, on some level, and to sort of see what it would feel like to take the foundation of D&D, the core of D&D, if you will, which is where the core in CORE20 kind of comes from,
Yeah.
and to see what you could do with it in a much, much different framework, and to see whether it would be fun to play. And for me, at least, the answer has been, yeah, a lot.
I know you said it was out in a, and I know it from reading kind of a public beta form, or not a kind of public beta form.
Yeah.
What have you heard in terms of like feedback, just generally? I know you get a lot of feedback, so trying to pick
Yeah.
things out of a haystack.
Lots of people looking at the game right now. The public playtest dropped last December, just sort of at the end of the year. It is available now. Lots of people looking at it, lots of people reading it, lots of people, virtually everyone who has reached out to me to say that they've looked at the game says they really, really like it.
Hmm.
They like the approach, they like the potential of it. They like the idea of a game that plays a lot like D&D, but feels very different in terms of what kind of characters you're building with it, and what
Yeah.
those characters are going to do, and what kinds of adventures you can build around characters like that as a result. I'm sure the people who looked at it and decided it's not for me, which is fair, because it does do things a little bit differently. And D&D 5e is an exceptional RPG, I think, and will continue to be so as the new edition drops, I'm sure. But at the very least, no one has reached out to me to tell me how much they hate it. So I'll take that as a small victory
Yeah.
in this
That's a
day
victory.
and age of social media.
What I'm curious because you just said that
Oh,
the
cool mug, by the way. He
oh
didn't
no,
get you. Thank you.
I saw I admired that the last time too, I think. What Oh, we should probably preface since this is audio. Scott's got a lovely D&D mug. Yeah,
Yeah.
Lovely
that's
D&D
it.
mug.
It all comes together. What about CORE20 results in a different adventure experience? Like, how does that manifest big picture?
Yeah, there's a couple of different answers to that, because the game has sort of two different things that I'm most proud of, two different sort of facets of it. One is the character building, right? So kind of that's sort of the start of the game, because that's your first kind of your first entry into it. If you're playing a game, if you're building a character, you can effectively build any type of character you want. Right now,
Hmm.
it's certainly possible to build a character that looks very much exactly like a stock D&D character.
Hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, those classic archetypes are archetypes for a reason, right? They're fun to play. They're recognizable in fiction. There's a real kind of
Yeah.
a grounding to them. And in fact, in the rules, in the first chapter on how to build your character, the rules actually present a number of quick build characters, where instead of having to select the options that you want freeform, right, to build a very highly customized character, you can simply say, I'm going to build a warrior character, right, which is equivalent of the fighter. I'm going to build a scoundrel who's kind of like the rogue. I'm going to build a protector who's kind of like the paladin. I'm going to build a spellcaster. And it tells you exactly which options to choose, and you
Hmm.
write those
Hmm.
options down, and you're pretty much ready to go,
Yep.
right? So you can start from that position if you want to. Start with something familiar and then kind of customize it as you go along, right? But one of the things that happens with the game is it's as you're improving your character, as you play the game, as you get more sessions and more adventures under your belt, as you improve your character, there's a design philosophy in the game which affects how you get better at things.
Okay.
And this was really sort of one of the first mechanical bits that I created for the game, because at the very first part of the process of trying to figure out, okay, how does no level advancement actually work? How's it going to look, right? And it harkened back a little bit to the AD&D games that I started with, because one of the big changes between AD&D and third edition D&D was the fact that third edition D&D level advancement got a lot faster. It got a lot more consistent,
Okay.
right? And 5e certainly has inherited that.
Mhm.
In AD&D, there was a very strong sense that you leveled up fairly quickly to start with, and then the game started to slow down a little bit, right? So it took longer, more adventures, more
Yeah.
game
Yeah.
time to get up to increasingly sort of like the mid levels and then to the higher levels.
Mhm.
And there was a point in a lot of AD&D games where you would just sort of, you get to 9th or 10th level, maybe 12th level, and that's felt like a natural point where the campaign should stop, right?
Okay.
Even though there was no, aside from a couple of character classes in AD&D that had fixed level caps. In AD&D, you could theoretically play to any level you wanted to, but the game naturally kind of lent itself to a sense of somewhere around 9th or 12th level, you just sort of stop, right?
Okay.
Because you feel like you've accomplished everything that you want to narratively, or
Yeah.
you want to as a character. And so what CORE20 does is sort of absorb a little bit of that with the philosophy that as a character, much like, us in real life, it's relatively easy to get good at something, but it takes more effort to get really good at something,
Right.
right? And it takes even more effort to
Right.
become the absolute best at something,
Mhm.
right? So what happens as a result of that is that, unlike traditional D&D, right, where each level you're effectively boosting yourself in a very linear fashion, very
Right.
sort of like a sense of vertical advancement, I would call
Mhm.
it,
Mhm.
right? In CORE20, because you get to the point where it's more difficult to increase yourself vertically, right? Because it takes more time to get better at the things you're already good at.
Right.
There's a huge incentive in the game to instead sort of spread out horizontally,
Oh,
right? And
that's
to say,
interesting.
okay, instead of getting like an example is, and this is very early on in the player's guide. It talks about like how feats work in the game, because the game is built, each thing that a character can do is called a feat,
Okay.
right? Feats
Mhm.
feats
Mhm.
in CORE20 look much more like feats in third edition than they look like feats in fifth edition, because feats in fifth edition are doing something quite different mechanically.
Okay.
But you can think of a feat as the equivalent of a class feature, effectively.
Mhm.
It's like, here's a brand new shiny thing I get to do,
Right.
right? So one of the baseline feats is a feat called weapon focus, which you do to get better at weapon combat, for example, right? There's also there's a similar feat called skill focus, which you take to get better at skills.
Interesting.
It's relatively easy to get up to like a +3 with your skills or with your weapon attacks. But if you then want to get a +4, +5, or +6, it basically takes you twice as long to
Yeah.
get each of those numbers.
Mhm.
And if you want to get up to 7, 8, or 9, it takes 3 times as long.
Right.
Based on the idea, again, that if you're really good at something, that's great. But if you want to get better than that, it takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of experience, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so what happens eventually is that when you get up to a number that you're comfortable with, right, sort of going vertically, you say, okay, rather than waiting 3 times as long to get the next +1, I'm going to take something else that gives me a different advantage in combat, or a different advantage in my skills and my social, in social encounters or in exploration or what have you, right? So talking about building encounters from that perspective, building adventures from that perspective, um, one of the things that I
Yeah.
really like about the system is that it's got a kind of what I'd call like a fairly narrow range of how good your characters are at things, right?
Okay.
You start out being pretty good and you can get better than that, but you don't have the progression that you have in games like third edition and in games like 5e, where at some point your characters effectively become superheroes,
Right.
right? About
Right.
ninth level in 5e, things start to get a little bit strange. And
Mhm.
beyond that, things get just really mystical, even for classes that are not magically based.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I love a good fantasy superhero game. I've written a ton of high level stuff for
Yeah.
different versions of D&D, right? But I always it always felt a little bit different to me than the experience of AD&D felt. where AD&D felt like you were more sort of centered in, you were centered in stories where your character was still powerful, but was still vulnerable,
Yeah.
I guess is
Yeah.
one way to put
Yep.
it. Right? And that's kind of the type of characters that CORE20 lets you build. And it sort of keeps you in what I've called in a previous blog post, sort of the sweet spot of D&D, where a lot of people, like even people playing 5e, there's a lot of general consensus that the best sort of levels of 5e are from about level 3 to level 7 or 8 or 9. And
Interesting.
that's where the game is the most fun for a lot
Yeah.
of players, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of anecdotal evidence about, you know, how far players play 5e, what level they get their campaigns get
Right.
up to. There's a lot of folks saying, you know, we stop at level 9, we stop at level 10. And I think the reason for that is because for a lot of folks, there is this sense that once you get to that level, you feel like you've completed something, you've finished something in terms of the story.
Right.
And it seems like a good place to sort of leave it off.
Really interesting. And so, I mean, it goes back to what kind of you opened this explanation with, that with CORE20, it does sound a lot closer to real life. And I realize
Yeah.
what I'm saying. It's fiction, it's
Yeah,
fantasy, but
yeah,
but it is a better, more air quotes accurate representation of real life. Of I'm in my mid 50s. I don't really want to keep honing this skill because what does it give me? I'm going to retread now and I'll start doing this and we'll see the adventures we can go. I mean,
yeah,
that's going that horizontal or lateral move. That's without the levels. That's really interesting because I can imagine the PC feeling more real, right? Like you said, not getting as silly as quickly.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think
That's a really good way to put it, actually. Yeah, you know, it's not it's definitely not a quote unquote realistic game. It's
Mm-mm.
not meant to be a realistic
Right.
game, but it's meant to feel like here's I'm going to go way off topic. There's a quote from William Faulkner, I think it is, that I've always loved. When he in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he talked about, I'm probably slightly misquoting it, but he talked about how great fiction should always be about the human heart in conflict with itself,
Mm.
right? And that's something that I've
Hmm.
always taken, you know, to heart, because I think it's a
Yeah.
brilliant approach to talking about why certain stories are compelling, or certain
Yeah.
stories are more
Yeah.
compelling than others. And I think it's possible. I think the best fantasy is fantasy that's about, you know, the humanoid heart in conflict with itself. You know, because you're not talking just about humans in most
Right.
cases, right? The idea of telling stories where the stakes feel real to the characters. That
Right.
for me has always been the best
Yeah.
type of gaming for
Yeah.
me. You know, those are the best adventures that I've worked on. As an editor, the best writing I've done in gaming is also sort of focused on that. And a game like 5e, as wonderful as 5e is, loses that a little bit at some point when your characters cross over into superheroic territory,
Hmm.
right? And the
Hmm.
game is still fun,
Right.
absolutely, right? It's an absolute blast to play high level stuff, assuming that your group is okay with the inherent complexity of playing at
Hmm.
that level, you know, with high level spells and monsters with huge stat blocks
Right.
and what have you. But the best games for me have always been ones that are more about the characters having personal stakes, right? And the
Yeah.
characters feeling like
Yeah.
they're very strongly attached to the world. And so having a slightly more realistic approach to character building, having this sense that, you know, you get to decide what you're good at. You
Hmm.
get to
Hmm.
decide what's important to you at every step of the way. You're never in a position where you're like, okay, I've leveled up, I get this class feature. I don't think I'm going to use this class feature, but I guess that's okay. Right? You never
Yeah.
have that sort of that dead space in your sense of who your character is and what you want your character to be and what you want them to do.
I think, you know, just watching as, you know, as you blog this and are kind of telling the story as it iterates, we've talked a lot in kind of past episodes about the idea of the hero's journey.
Hmm.
Right.
And there's different,
Yeah.
and
Great
again,
catch.
you know, there's like with a D&D or like a Pathfinder or something like that, there's levels. It's designed to be that way. It's a very cool game to play
Yeah.
for those of us who even in the fantasy world like a little idea of realism. Um, the hero's journey in CORE20 feels a little more, and this kind of goes to what you were saying, Jason, feels a little more realistic,
Mm.
you know, and I can, and the reason I bring that up is, you know, Jason and I were talking right before you came on, you know, someone gets to a certain point in their career and do they want to take the extra effort and push it? or do
Right.
they want to spread out and try different things
Right.
and become a different person? And so your game resonates with me that way, just
Yeah.
because
Right.
that's in many ways how we live our life. So
Yeah.
there's a real life component to it, even if we're playing in a dungeon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Choose to take on a different challenge, a different journey is
Yeah.
part of your development.
Yeah. And the idea of having, I mean, anytime you talk about a character or a player's ability to choose something, that at the heart of it is what Core 20 is about. You should be able to choose anything you want,
Yeah.
right? You should be
Right.
absolutely unrestricted in terms of what you can do. There are some slight, I mean, there are some tiny restrictions in terms of like if you want to take one particular feat, you may have to take a prerequisite feat first.
Mhm.
There aren't a lot of those. Most of those sort of line up to, for example, magic use. Like if you want to become a spellcaster,
Yeah, that
right?
makes
There are
sense.
different feats that you need
Right.
that give you certain aspects of your spellcasting prowess, right? So those are all sort of interconnected. But even then, there are cool options that you can get away with. I've got one player who's building a character for our next campaign. We're still finishing the one we're in right now, but he's already working on a character for that. And he's using an option where you can create a character who simply casts 0-level spells. That's the only
Oh,
thing they ever want to do.
Yeah.
They're right.
oh,
They never
that's
want to cast a
cool.
1st-level spell at all, right? They have no
Okay.
ambition to become, like a book study caster or
Yeah.
to, rise in the ranks of their animist power. Animists in Core 20 are what we're calling clerics in the game,
Ah, okay. That makes
right?
sense. Hmm.
Yeah, and it's an option that you can choose. You can simply say, I want to dabble in minor magic, and that's going to be my specialization, in addition to the other stuff that I'm
Oh,
really good
that's
at.
interesting.
And you don't have to invest in the idea of like, okay, I'm going to play a wizard,
Right.
right? Because if you play a wizard, then there's this expectation that you're going to, you're going to have to level up to get better at stuff. You can certainly do the same thing in 5e with multi-classing, right?
Yeah.
But multi-classing in 5e gets really complicated really quickly. And there's still a sense of you may get stuck with stuff that you don't want to, that
Hmm.
isn't really part of your character,
Right.
but you kind of inherit it anyway, because you're taking what the class and the subclass kind of hands to you, right?
There's,
Um,
oh, go ahead. Sorry, I was
I
going
was
to
just going
just,
to say, yeah,
I,
just
yeah.
talking about sort of like the realistic feel of the game. Yes, I think that's absolutely what's at the heart of a lot of the work I've done on the game. Is I want it to feel like you can create characters who are more connected to the world and to each other and to the story.
Right.
But having said that, just so there's no misunderstanding in anybody's mind, you can still play the game in an absolutely over the top fantasy fashion, because that's what
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
also built for. In the current campaign that I just mentioned, our last session, the characters were on a flying ship that they'd stolen, right? Fighting another flying ship and also dealing with dragons who are flying in and
Yeah.
attacking both ships at the same
Yeah.
time.
See,
When
that's
in
so
Rome.
cool.
Yeah, one of the best things that happened, like while the ships were like lobbing cannon fire and ballistas back at each other, one character decided to use Dimension Door to go over to the other ship because they were close enough, and basically took out the captain of that ship, grabbed them, and then teleported back with her, right, onto the ship. So the game is just as wide open in terms of the things
Wow.
the kinds of shenanigans that the characters can get up to. But the foundation of it is a little bit different than the foundation of 5e.
There's little known Dice and Mind trivia. I had heard of it before um, we had talked with you, but you are the one who um, triggered me digging down into Traveler a bit more.
Oh, okay.
And um,
Oh, it's your fault then, Scott. I don't
yeah,
remember that.
so both
Well,
classic Mark Miller Traveler and
I
Mongoose
mean,
Traveler.
to
Yeah,
Brad's case in point, like he keeps
there you
sending me
go.
stuff as I
Yes.
hold up a traveler book. Yeah.
So the question, going off on a tangent, is when you're
Yeah,
creating your character, you
yeah.
can't die during creation, right?
You cannot.
Okay.
It's a sort of a, there's two different approaches. And again, part of the whole thing about the game is I want the game to be as open and as accessible to anybody.
Yeah.
If you want to come in and just say, I want to play this type of character, there are there's basically three different options for building a character relatively quickly. And this is all in the first chapter of the book. One
Okay.
option is you can just pick one of these archetypal character builds. You can build yourself a
Hmm.
warrior, you can build yourself an arcane caster, You can build yourself a protector, which is kind of like a paladin, right? They're all there. They're ready to go. It basically tells you exactly, like it says, like, here's the feats you take, right? For a starting character starts with what are called 20 feat slots. And a feat slot is what you use to pay for a feat that you then take. And the reason there's the distinction is that talking about how it gets more difficult to get better at something as the better you are at something, the more difficult it is to get even better at it. Certain feats cost 1 feat slot. And then at some point, those same feats start to cost you 2 feat slots or 3 feat slots. And that's where that idea of it takes you twice as long to get really good with your broadsword or your longsword, right? Or really, really good with your thievery skill, right? After a certain point. So that's one option. You can go down and you've got a starting character ready to go, right? The other option is there's a selection of what are called feat packages in the book. And you can look at feat packages and you can decide, okay, I want a little bit of this and a little bit of that, like some from column A and some from column B, right? There's another option, which is freeform builds, which is you basically just decide you're going to pick feats any way you want to, right? But there are still some guidelines there saying, okay, as you're building your freeform character, here are some things to keep in mind, right? So like for a feat package, you could say, for example, okay, I want to be a straight up spellcaster. My long-term ambition is I'm going to play a straight arcanist, an arcane caster. And it tells you, okay, if you're doing that, here's what you take. Right? These are the spellcasting feats you take, and it tells you how many feat slots you're going to spend on those. You then get to decide, okay, in addition to that, I think I might also want to be a crack shot with a bow. Right? I don't want to get into combat, but if I am in combat, I want to be 300 feet away from it and shooting into it as opposed to in the middle of it waving a dagger. Right? So you simply select that package and it says, this is the package you need to be an archer. Right? And it tells you what you get, tells you how good you are at your range attacks and so on and so forth. Right? You then might decide what kind of defenses you want. You might want to say, okay, I need to figure out if I'm going to wear armor or not. The same kind of restrictions about wearing armor in arcane casting are in CORE20 that were in 3rd edition. Right? So you may decide, okay, I can't do that. So maybe I'm going to choose another option where I'm going to focus on being an unarmored defender. Right? So I'm going to get basically a bonus to my defense if I don't wear armor, because that's what I've trained to do. Right? You might decide which of your saving throws you want to improve, because nothing comes sort of stock, right? Everything, you get to choose everything, right? You get to decide which of your saving throws you want to be better at, right? You've got the baseline of what your ability scores are, right? And your ability scores will make you good at certain saving throws. If you got a high dex, you're going to be better at defense because you're just better at getting out of the way, because you get your defense mod, you get your dex mod on your defense as normal, right? But you can then decide, okay, I'm pretty good at getting out of the way because my dex is high, my wisdom is terrible, right? So I'm going to make sure that my will save is bumped up a little bit because I absolutely don't want to end up, being vulnerable to that sort of thing. Right? Yeah, so you've got like just building starting character, you've got those 3 different options, right? So it's relatively easy to get going. One of the other rules in the game is you can also retrain feats. For the most part, there are a couple of minor exceptions, but 99% of feats you can retrain. So for example, if you decide that you invest in a certain amount of spell casting, at some point you decide, I feel like I'm going in a different direction, right? You can untrain some of the spell casting feats you've taken, and you can trade those in for new feats. You basically forget some of what you've learned in order to focus on something else, right? And that can be great fun. One of the things that I like about that is it lets you create sort of interesting NPCs, in the sense that D&D 5e, all versions of D&D really, if you've got like a high level NPC, that high level NPC is probably also a superhero, even if you don't want them to be.
Right.
Right. Because even if they're like, oh, we're gonna go up and hang out with the old mage because he's got some information we need, right? That mage, even if you're just there for information, can maybe still cast 12th level spells, right? And so he's capable of, like mowing through, townsfolk and blowing buildings up and the whole bit.
Right.
And it's
You
sometimes a bit
say
of a
that
stretch
like
to
it's a
explain.
bad thing. Sorry, keep going.
It's a fine thing when the player characters are doing it, but it's a fine line to walk when you're trying to explain why the NPCs aren't doing it, right?
Yeah.
One of the NPCs in my current campaign, who is actually an NPC from a campaign that I ran 30 years ago, because the campaign I'm running now is a sequel to that campaign, right? I've set up the idea that he's a very high level caster, but in his retirement, he basically traded in all of his feats that improved his defenses and improved his hit points in order to get more sort of lore based and information and magic based stuff. So he's basically got 7 hit points right now, even though he's still capable of casting 10th level spells,
Jeez.
right? So in last week's session, talking about the flying ship, he went down twice because everything that hits him basically takes him out.
Right.
He was on the deck. They're like literally trying to get him off the deck and down below. And just the time it takes to do that, he goes like anything that hits him even peripherally, right,
Oh
is
my
enough
God.
to take him down. So it's a fun way to sort of set things up because you can build NPCs that are very, very customized in terms of they can be good at one thing and really bad at everything else, as opposed to most characters, if you're building them using the player character rules, right, they're probably much better than you want them to be at certain things.
That's, I mean, you could be a caster adventurer, and like you just said, you go into retirement, you don't need your defensive skills anymore. You're sitting at
Yeah,
home, you're reading,
yeah,
you're upping your magic skill, but you're not out there swinging a
Or
sword or
or
attacking anything.
vice versa. And I know I'm as they say crossing the streams on this one, but this makes me think of Luke in the final film of
oh,
Luke Skywalker of just like super customization, right? Of took the
mhm.
min out of min-max a little too seriously, but like you're getting rid of all this other stuff
Yeah,
for the sake of the character and a narrative, regardless of what we thought of like what they did with the movie.
right,
Um, but there's that kind of freedom in
yeah,
Core 20. You can really, really mess around in some unique ways then.
yeah, you really can. I mean, that's one of the things that I like the most about it is just the flexibility of character creation kind of creates a great general framework for building
Yeah.
characters any way you want to, both the player characters and the NPCs, the villains that they fight, right? And yeah, there's lots of cool storytelling potential there. Which, sorry, going back to the question I think that started this whole thing several hours ago, talking about customizing adventures, right?
Yeah.
And
Oh
how
yeah.
that works. Um,
Mhm.
one of the other things that Core 20 does, sort of one of the other foundational bits of the mechanics where it departs most severely from standard D&D and standard D20 fantasy, is what I call a sliding scale of success for your D20 rolls.
Okay.
So specifically your attack rolls, your saving throws, and your skill checks, right? One of the things that bothers me the most about D&D traditionally, since right from the beginning, and certainly through third edition, which expanded skills a lot more, so you had more opportunities for this to become a problem, and fifth edition, which largely inherited that approach from previous editions, even though the math is quite different, is the idea that if you fail a check, if you fail an attack roll, you fail a skill check, you fail a saving throw, it's a strict pass or fail line. There's no
Right.
shades of gray there,
Right.
right? And it can work out okay in some games. It generally works well, I think, in a game where everything's happening pretty quickly.
Hmm.
But as a lot of people talk about online, especially in games where it takes a long time to go around the table, right? Because everybody's doing complicated
Right.
stuff and there's
Right.
complicated monsters, right? If it takes you 5 minutes, 10 minutes, to get back to you for your turn, and you miss on your attacks both turns, you've spent a significant portion of your game time not doing anything,
Right.
right? Which can be frustrating for a lot of people. And there's lots of folks talking about it. There's lots of folks who have sort of like different approaches to sort of speeding up combat and making things go fast. And a lot of those are approaches I don't care for, like the idea of like a 1 minute timer, I think some people talk about. And
Oh, yeah, no.
if the player doesn't go within 1 minute, they lose their turn kind of thing, which
We'd
seems
never have
ridiculous.
any turns in any of our games.
Yeah.
um, so what Core 20 does is it sets up a sliding scale of success so that if you hit the target number, it's a success, same as
Okay.
in
Yep.
any other version of the game. If you get close to the target number, you get a success with a complication, right?
There
It's
we
a
go.
kind of a
Yep.
fail forward scenario, but it digs into it in a little more detail
Yeah.
because the idea with it isn't simply here's some mechanical options. It's not something like Dungeon World, for example,
Mhm.
right? Which has that same idea, or fourth edition, which had on a hit, this is the effect for your encounter powers and your daily powers. because you're limited in how often you use them. There was usually always something that happened even if you missed, right? Just to make it, feel kind of sweet that you're using this important power, and you get something out of it one way or the other.
Yeah.
Right? But in CORE20, the idea is that if you get a success with a complication, you, the player, and the DM get to decide what that means. It's not a fixed thing saying you automatically do this or you gain such and such, right? So, for example, okay, just like if you get an attack roll, right? You're making an attack roll, the defense is a 20 and you get like a 17 on it. You get to decide what that means within the narrative of the game.
Yeah,
And it can
there we
be
go.
anything you want it to be. There's some examples in the book. It says here are the most common things you can do, right? One of the obvious ones, and this is something, it's an easy default, is just to say, I want to deal half damage, right? That's
Yeah,
the complication. That's right. I hit this guy, but I did not hit him as hard as I wanted to, right? So you roll your damage, I deal half, right? So in a game where you've got a lot of people all fighting the same thing, you think that's a risk I can take, right? He's going to stay standing a little bit longer, right? But
Yep.
I'm doing the best that I can. But there are other more narratively interesting options too. For
Yeah.
example, you say, I want to deal full damage on this. I want to turn this into an actual solid hit. So the complication then you get to decide is what happens to me as a result of that.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe it's I hit him so hard that I spin past him and I end up prone. And I'm willing to make that sacrifice in order to turn that near miss into an actual solid hit. It could be something like I leave myself off balance. So when he attacks me next round, maybe he's got a better chance of hitting me, right? Because I put everything into it.
Right.
For certain monsters or somebody wearing spiky armor, it could be I smash myself at him and I take 1d4 damage,
Yes.
right? Because I basically, bash my head against him as I'm darting in and out.
Sounds like your characters, Jace.
Well, not only, but it like this. I mean, Scott, what you're describing is one of my very favorite elements of some of the more narrative dice systems out there,
Yeah.
right? The mechanics where, I mean, clearly but this is interesting because it's a D20 where like you have, as you said, you have those complications. And again, it is more representative of real life. I mean,
Mhm.
when I don't want to sound morbid here, but really in life, I think just complete wins are exceptionally rare, right?
Yeah.
Maybe astronomically rare, because that's not real life, because real life is messy and complicated, and there are all these, countless variables, most of which we're not aware of. And so something might be just brilliantly successful, but by the way, there's this unrelated thing that just still sucks in the background, right? And
Yeah.
and wouldn't it be great if it was just that? And so when there's this element of a complication for, like you said, kind of a partial win, that to me just makes the gameplay all that
Yeah.
more interesting. And I love that it can be part of the mechanic because it's not a cheat, it's woven in.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's designed to allow players and characters to drive the story in unexpected ways, right? The story
Yeah,
of
yeah,
combat in D&D generally is you keep hitting and at some point one side or the
right,
other goes
right.
down. And that's the only story that D&D combat typically tells.
Hmm.
There are subtle, variations in that in terms of, you have tactics and strategy and can we take advantage of the location, right? But really those just come down to I hit him in a certain way,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But it's still each round is do I hit him or do I not hit him, right?
yeah.
And with this option, there are other things you can do, and it's designed very much for the player and the DM to sort of interact that way.
No.
It's not meant to be like the DM automatically decides what happens,
Mm.
though the DM always has sort of final say. If a
Yeah,
player
right.
suggests something that seems a little bit too sweet, like in order to turn this into a full hit, my shoelace comes untied. You're like, maybe not. Might need something a little bit sharper than that, right?
Right.
But in terms of adventure design and encounter design, it opens up things a lot more because it tends to make encounters go more quickly, right?
Yeah,
If you think
yeah.
about like a default scenario where everybody just says, I'm just going to deal half damage every time I miss, right? Which is the least interesting narrative option, but it's
Hmm.
perfectly valid.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're dealing more damage, the fight ends more quickly, right?
Right.
If you have the opportunity to do things that are a little bit more creative, right?
Hmm.
You're not necessarily limited by, okay, what environmental things has the adventure designer put in here that I can take advantage of. You know, there's a
Yeah.
chandelier, I'm going to swing on it, you know, to get advantage on my next attack kind of thing. You can make that happen yourself if you want to,
Hmm.
right? You can say, okay, I'm going to do something which is going to improve my chances, or, you know, I'm going to make a sacrifice in one way in order to do something better next time. Something else that comes up a lot is if you get a partial hit or a hit with a complication, is to say, I'm not going to deal any damage this time, but I'm going to give my opponent disadvantage on their next defense
Yeah,
roll.
that's
Because core
cool.
20, yeah,
See.
core 20 uses opposed rolls, right? So like instead of a
Hmm.
fixed AC, you have a defense roll that you make against an attack roll, right? So you can say, you know, my attack doesn't hit him, but it throws him off balance, right? He's kind of reeling back where he got out of the way of my attack. So my follow-up attack, or even my ally's follow-up attack, right? Because I miss him, but I know that my barbarian best friend is standing right behind him, right? Ready to smote. And off he goes, right?
I
I just
imagine. Oh, go ahead.
I hear this as this game has nuance without overcomplication.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Is
hopefully.
really,
that's
yeah,
key.
It's the game can be as complicated as you want it to be. And that's one thing, that there's a lot of stuff in the game. The player's guide is pretty hefty.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
a second book in the playtest called the Magic Grimoire, which is where spells and magic items are split off to,
nice.
right? Because otherwise the player's guide would have been bigger than I wanted it to be. There's a lot of stuff in it, but one of the interesting things about the game is because everything is freeform, you have a great ability to choose what you do or don't want to focus on in the game, right?
Right. Yeah.
One example is, and this is sort of probably the most extreme in terms of talking about this as a variation of D&D, is that you can play a game without combat if you really want to. Because D&D
Right.
generally is a game where it's like combat is the default, right? Even if you're like building a character,
Yep.
like if you're building a wizard, right? And you're like, I never want to get into combat, right? Your wizard at 10th level still has like a +7 on attacks with his dagger if he wants to. He may never want to use his dagger, but he's as good with his dagger as anybody else would be at that same level, right? On the baseline, right? There are lots of different options in the game for making non-combat or making non-traditional combat fun. One of the last systems that I created was a system called combat maneuvers, which I blogged about not too long ago. And the incentive behind that was I was sort of thinking about the game, and I thought I would like the game to be as fun. I'd like it to be as fun to not kill your enemies
Right.
as it is
Right.
in traditional D&D to kill your enemies. Right? D&D, it's always been easier to kill opponents than to let them live.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do something a little bit different? And I actually ran a short playtest campaign when I first did those rules, where the idea was it was an urban campaign and everybody basically built a character. And I said, okay, we're going to exclude weapon feats from your character builds. Just carve them all off. We just said there's a big chunk of weapon feats here. You don't get to pick any of them. Right. I think I said you could take weapon focus once. You could get like a +1 bonus with your favorite weapon, but that's it if you wanted to. Right. And it was great to see what everybody else did. We had one character who was, I think she was a sewer worker who moonlighted as a professional wrestler in an underground wrestling ring. Right. So she focused on combat maneuvers for grappling. Right. And, you know, sort of like,
Makes sense.
like getting in and out of combat quickly, but without having to actually like hurt anybody if she didn't
Right.
want to, right? Lots of folks just focused on magic. Had one character who was a kobold notary public, and he focused on illusion magic, right? So like it was a campaign where I said fights are absolutely going to happen. People are going to come after you. You're going to need to get away from them, right?
Nice.
But you need to think of ways to get away from them that don't involve just sort of like line in the sand, draw my sword, and we'll see who survives this fight. Right. And it was a really cool campaign. Lots of really interesting stuff happened. So yeah, it's I mean, you can build characters that do things that characters don't really do that well in D&D if you want to. And you can
Oh,
run different types of games, different types of campaigns that way.
so toward the kind of to summarize this, but man, because it really I wanted to go here, but it really feels like you're taking us here anyways. For a moment, let's talk session zero.
Sure.
Or maybe you're an anti-session zeroite. I mean,
Definitely not an anti-session
okay.
zero. Love
So
session zero.
so I think we tend to agree. Like I think Brad and I have learned, and we've learned with some others with whom we've played, or at least tried to play or plan to play,
Yeah.
that the session zero, that's so important, right? Because you have to you want to learn who the table is and set things up. And it sounds like to me that Core 20, because of its design, because of its flexibility, especially because of those complications and whatnot, and but just the way you create characters, it sounds like, and I mean this in a positive sense, there's some potential work to do in session zero where you can kind of lay out expectations, but
Mhm.
this sounds cliche, but a little more joyously than you might in a game like Traveler or D&D,
Yeah,
because those expectations through the mechanic could
yeah,
have a real fine could offer a real fine tuning, right? Where
absolutely.
you're
Yeah.
you're not caged in. I mean, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. A sort of a small confession. I love the idea of session zero. I generally don't run session zero myself because I play all my games online. So it's more
Oh,
convenient for me
yeah.
playing with players I've known for years, so
Yeah,
we're all
that
kind of
yeah,
invested in the
absolutely.
game. I do like session zero over a number of weeks of emails back and forth, and I'll post little players
Yes,
guides and stuff like that.
exactly.
But it's definitely absolutely the same process. And as you say, it does when you're setting out the parameters for your campaign, you get to set out things and say, okay, think about these things when you're putting your character together. I
Yep.
ran one wonderful campaign some years ago. It was a long, I think it was 4 years of real time and 5 years of game time. It was a
Wow.
wonderful long session, long campaign.
Wow.
And the dictate that I gave to the players when it started, I said, none of your characters have any ambition to be heroes.
Nice.
You are normal people doing normal
Nice.
stuff in this town where you live.
Yes.
Okay. At some point, things are going to happen and you're going to react to that by becoming a hero. You're going to follow that
See,
path.
right back to Brad's comment of the hero's journey. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Oh, neat.
But at the start of things, you're basically just living your life. You have no idea that this stuff's going to happen. And I got
Mhm.
some amazing builds. I had one character who was actually a actual built like an actual D&D character, right? She was an archer, phenomenal archer, right?
Okay.
Focused everything on archery skills, but she was in hiding. She hid that from everybody else. She was basically on the run from another country, right? And
Nice.
just living her life. She was working as like a Fletcher. She made arrows, right? That was her day job, right? But at the end of the day, if she needed to, she could pull out a bow. She could pull a bow out and
Yeah.
basically shoot an apple off of somebody's head at
Right,
300
right.
yards. I had another character who was also in hiding because she'd accidentally assassinated someone a couple
It
of years
happens.
previously. It happens, yeah. Had other characters who were just very much, yeah, I'm just living my life, right? Had one character who was like a guy who just sort of like worked for the church, right? Laborer and blacksmith, and that was his whole life, right? And eventually, so everybody's path in terms of getting sort of called into the heroic journey,
Yeah.
that call to
That's so
action, which is
cool.
the first
That's really
stage.
interesting.
It felt very different for everybody. Everybody had their own reasons for sort of wanting to get involved when bad things started to happen in the community that they were living in, right? And
You
it was an awesome campaign. It was an awesome game. One of my best experiences in running D&D over 30 odd years.
Yeah.
I know, we've heard this a lot, but I'm just so impressed anytime I hear, like you're saying, you've been running you ran a
Oh,
long
I
campaign
know.
for 4 years. Um, I mean, so impressive for people to continue to stay engaged. I
Yeah.
hear this, as we've been talking kind of in the realm of like the one with the spaceships and the dragons. And I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter anything else that was said. You got me
Airships.
right there.
Airships
Oh,
are
airships.
important and
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I made a mistake, but
Yeah.
do you see this game, used within different genres of RPGs?
I would
Um,
love to see this game used in different genres of RPGs. Right now, I'm focusing on Core 20, which is a fantasy game, right?
Mhm.
mhm.
When I eventually release it, it could potentially have a different name, and Core 20 might just be the name of the underlying system. I haven't quite
Yeah.
decided yet. But Core 20 right now is just sort of that's what I'm focusing on, and that's what I'm calling it. But one of the great things about the game is that the fact that it's all freeform, right? The fact that you can drop any rules you want to. You can add, you use certain things. You can use part of certain things. Like you could say, we're going to allow weapon feats, but we're going to cap them at a certain level. You could run a low magic
Yeah.
campaign if you wanted to by saying we're
Right.
capping spellcasting feats at this tier, right? You
Right.
can say you can go up to cast third level spells, but beyond that, you simply can't, right? That knowledge does not exist in this world if you wanted to, right? The way that it's set up, you could very easily convert it into other genres. One example is the skills system, right?
Okay.
The skill system that is set up was intended to be kind of a hybrid between what fourth edition did with skills, having a nice short list, right? And what third edition did with skills, having a whole bunch of separate individual finicky things. And the idea in CORE20 is you got a relatively short list. I think it's 12 or 13 skill groups. And then there are individual skills within those, right? And the skill groups are familiar to anyone who's played 5e. It's like acrobatics and athletics
Yeah.
and arcana, which is, it's called magic, but it's basically the same thing, right? But the idea is that within acrobatics, for example, you can get good at acrobatic skills, but the acrobatic skill group covers a bunch of different specific skills. For example, and
Okay.
climbing and escape and all that sort of thing, right? So you can decide if you want to that you want to just get good at one particular thing, right? The perception skill group covers searching, it covers spot, it covers listen. You might decide that your character is really exceptional at spot. So you're the best there is at seeing danger when it's a long way away, but if it's standing right beside you, you really suck, right? That kind of thing. There's also in the skills, there's a thing called personal skill groups. And that's the idea that in addition to those standard skill groups, you can take anything else you want. You can take the sailor skill, for example.
Nice.
If your character spends some time on a boat. The current campaign, Witcher's on ships,
Right.
one character has that. You can take any skills basically that tie into a vocation or a trade or a hobby or what have you, right? And the interesting thing about that, the way that it's set up, I think I might talk about this in the book. I talked about this in the book in the rules at one point. I might have cut it. But the idea is if you look at the existing skills, which is like acrobatics, athletics, investigation, that kind of thing, each of those is exactly the same as a personal skill. Those are just the standard skills that most fantasy games can make use of, right? So the acrobatics skill group is exactly the same as if you said, I'm going to make a character and their personal skill is going to be acrobat, right? The athletic skill is exactly the same as if you said, I'm going to make a character and their personal skill is going to be athlete or investigator, and that sort of thing, right?
Okay.
So if you wanted to adapt CORE20 to another genre, the easiest thing to do is just say, let's just cut out this list of prefab skills and everything is a personal skill. Or to say in this particular world, if we're doing like a modern day espionage thing, these are the skill groups that are going to replace these fantasy focused skill groups. Right.
I could just see so many different offshoots just because I'm I've been a fan of the mechanic, to see how it can be used in other areas. Jason, I don't know if you had anything else. I was just going to ask one more question.
No, I know where you're going, and this is where I want to
go. So obviously out in beta form, do you have any plans? You kind of talked about how you're going to title it. You don't know where that's going to go yet. Are you looking at like doing like a paper publishing of it, like a Kickstarter or something
really,
like that?
What's next, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's always been the plan. I mean, the game has gone through a long evolution. The game, I started the first inklings of what's turned into the game. It goes back to 2010.
Wow.
Right. In 2010, the game started out as just a set of house rules for 3.5. So I was playing 3.5 at that time. This was into the fourth edition era already, but I'd been playing 3.5 in a play by post campaign with some friends of mine.
Wow.
And so we were playing 3.5 and we were talking about different things, and one player wanted some different options that didn't quite fit with the standard progression. I said, well, let me think about, what we might do with this. And the idea for, if you were going to do a game that didn't have classes and didn't have levels, what would that look like? That's where the first kernel of that idea came from, right? And the game was house rules for, I think, like almost 6 years, probably more than 6 years. Like it didn't become like one book until 2016 or so, when we were on, I think, version 3 or version 4 of the rules at that point. And it was strictly just my own game. It was me and some friends and a few other people who were interested, who I showed things to, right? I think at the outset, if I'd said, hey, it would be a great idea to just write a whole game, I never would have started. But the idea was always this was just going to be a little house rule thing. But the feedback that I got on it from people who saw it, and as I got more interested in expanding it, getting to the point where I realized I want this to be its own system. The end goal is absolutely, I want to get this out. I want to publish it. I want it to be beautiful. But because the game exists and the game is playable, I thought it would be great to put it out and just let people play it.
Yeah, really cool.
I mean, like as a beta playtest, any feedback I can get is gold, obviously.
Yep.
One of the things that I've asked about, or one of the things that I've mentioned in the playtest documents, is the player's guide might actually be bigger than it needs to be. There may be a lot of options in there that the core rules don't need. Like there may be combat stuff that you look at and you go, this would be better in like a specialized combat guide or an advanced combat
Okay.
guide. Right? There may be some magic stuff that could be split off. It might be okay as it is. You know, I'm hoping to get that feedback from people specifically as the playtest goes on. But yeah, at some point, I mean, I think the game is really good. I've been enjoying playing it for,
Cool.
14 years now. Everybody I've played it with enjoys it.
Yeah.
Everybody who's looked at it, as I said, for the most part, says this is really cool.
Yeah.
It's not a game for everyone,
Yeah.
right? It's a different approach to D20 based fantasy. And like I said, this is not like, I love D&D 5e. 5e is absolutely the best version of D&D that's ever been produced, in my opinion. And I've worked on quite a bit of it, so that statement comes with a certain amount of inside knowledge, I guess.
Yeah.
But I've always wanted to tell stories that D&D doesn't tell as well as I would like them to. And so CORE20 is sort of the result of that. And at some point, I'd like to put it out in a forum that other people can tell those stories too.
So cool.
I think, there's no perfect game for anyone anyway. And I've seen, over time, especially with, some of these narrative systems, that I think this could really hit my hope personally. And again, we aren't paid for any advertisement. I personally think that this could have a real positive effect in creating another path for people to get into RPGs, and that it feels more realistic to them, even if I'm fighting dragons.
Sure.
Where can we, as we wrap up, where's the best place? And we'll put this all in the show notes, but where's the best place to get information on CORE20, get the playtest information and so on? How can folks get there?
Yeah, the best place to go is to the website core20rpg.com.
Okay.
And that will redirect you to the blog, which is core20rpg.wordpress.com. But core20rpg.com will take you there. Once you're there, you'll see a link right up at the very top that says the CORE20 playtest. And that takes you to a page where you can download everything.
Yeah. It's so cool what you're doing with that. It's just so open.
Yeah.
And I'd recommend folks jump on and connect up, because you by no means spam anyone's inbox. Everything that you've sent over that I read is really well done. It's not, like I said, you don't get them all that often, but when you do, it's very strategic in the information you give. And I have found it very helpful, just because with everything going on. Sometimes I just run low on time. Like earlier tonight, we were talking about something and I'm like, oh, what did I miss today? So thank you so much for all that. I know we had you on prior time and we talked a lot about past experience that the stuff that you worked on. We didn't want to minimize that here. I just felt like, and I think in talking with you, we could go on for hours about CORE20 before we even talk about the other stuff that you have worked on in the past, or, delve into that deeper.
And for a subsequent discussion, we still have to come around to the discussion of ethics and philosophy and where's the industry going.
Sure.
We're going to get there.
The small questions. We got 30 seconds left. We can wrap that up quickly.
Right.
And so again, we'll need to have you. We'll give you a chance to breathe and decompress from having to deal with us, and then we'd love to have you back on, because there's lots of other topics. And again, that kind of sit around the world of RPGs in general, and with your background, it would be fascinating to get your perspective on it.
Oh, anytime at all.
Many thanks again to Scott for joining us.
Yes.
And I'm really excited for the day when he announces plans to put CORE20 in print. We've talked about this.
Yes.
I love PDF's great. I love a good printed rule book.
Yep. And, even a good supplement.
And this one is going to be outstanding. So as we say that, why don't we, much like we did
back in the
every
day.
Thursday in the fall of '96,
Good
Um,
memory, man.
head over, we got in your car and we'd listen to,
No, spring of.
no, it was fall of 96 because we were talking about the election results and some of the stuff at
Oh
one of the
man.
times we were there.
Oh, of course. Yep, I'm
And
with
it
you.
because of the
Yep.
fall weather, we
Yep.
then opened the windows and we'd listen to Imagine by John Lennon.
A lot. As we
Hmm.
drove Lakeshore Drive.
Yep, exactly. So
Yep.
let's head on over, even though in real life it doesn't exist any longer,
No,
but in
but
the
it
minds
does
of
for
Dyson
us.
Mind, it does here. Let's head on
Yes.
over to Autobahn Court.
I love it.
Um, I'll just, I think I told you right before we hit record for the episode, I had a topic I wanted to talk about, and I was going to take a note like a sticky and put
Yeah.
it like virtual sticky,
Yeah.
and um, it lost it for me. But
That's
I will
unfortunate.
say this, because for those that are listening, I'm doing some study work on the side, so it's
Hmm.
limited my time with RPGs other than, and what little time I have for it, Jason and I are doing our STA adventure. Um,
Hmm.
but um, you and I had a really good discussion the other night about AI
That was so much
and
fun.
yeah,
Yeah.
and its interactions. And it had me thinking just in the context. Now I remember what I was going to talk about.
Well,
So I'll come to that.
yeah, finish
Yeah, I'm
this
going to
though.
finish this
Yeah.
one. I'm going to come to the second one.
Good.
Um, I am still curious to see how AI is going to affect all of the different minuscule macro and micro facets of the RPG world when it comes to content creation, when it comes to, you know, creating and running games potentially.
Hmm.
There's so many different areas, and you know, AI has hit, I think, faster than many anticipated.
Certainly.
And so really um, that was one of the things that came out, and the conversation ended just because it was late.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it
Not
just
that
got me.
late.
What's that?
Not that late.
It was what, like quarter to 10? 10, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, I was on a late walk. You're right. It was late.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's not late for many. I mean, for Jim, that's probably breakfast time. But um,
So
sorry,
it's
Jim, I
fun.
had to.
It's funny
But
you bring up Jim because I was going to offer in response. I think the best response to your kind of rhetorical question that
yeah,
I've yet heard is from our friends Jim Johnson and Michael Dismuke with Modiphius and Star Trek Adventures. And in one of their, I think, fairly recent podcast episodes of Continuing Conversations, this came up very organically in their discussion. I'm paraphrasing here, but I think this has salience, and I think it jibes with what you and I have been talking about already. That, if you look at that AI, and I'm paraphrasing, but I also agree, AI should perhaps have no place in content creation among any of the publishers, right? We want
yeah,
artists and writers, etc., to have work and to be creative and be well reimbursed for that. That said, AI, and specifically because you know better than I do, and we know better than most. I mean, we're talking about just machine learning here, right? And we're
yeah,
talking about whatever large language models and other things. But whatever AI means, as Jim and Michael opined on their episode, AI and ChatGPT and all this stuff, it can be a tool at your personal gaming table
mhm,
to help you in the moment generate character names or plot
yes.
ideas or just food for thought. And I think through a homebrew lens, there's a real potential for that to aid novice and expert players and GMs alike.
I did this very early on with
You
ChatGPT, and
did
I
it
think you,
super early.
yeah, and you did something a little more recently, if I remember correctly, where you used it to generate. Didn't you use it to generate like a role-playing game around the Muppets or something like that? Or
Oh. So I got bored. I was curious one afternoon evening, and I used ChatGPT to generate Star Wars scrolls, but then I would enter things like like Muppets Take Over the Galaxy, and that one was laugh out loud.
Oh,
That
it was quite good when you
it was
posted it.
so good.
That
Yeah,
was the same day you and I conversed about um academia and
yeah,
professional
right,
realms.
right,
Um, how much are we going to see writing or what people write
right.
um
Yes. Hmm.
be generated by AI versus their own
Hmm.
hand
Yeah.
or their own keyboard?
So to pivot, what's the other? You
Oh, the
said
other one.
you remembered. What's your other
So yes,
topic?
and I don't know why it popped up. I was going to mention to you, I find this fascinating, is that we will always be, um, I mean, we're always going to be an RPG podcast. That's what we,
Yes.
you know, but it's funny how we get some really cool people from the realm of science
Oh my
on here.
goodness.
You were talking about a potential one before we recorded, someone to put on the list.
Yep.
And I'm just thinking back to, um, some of the and I'm afraid if I start listing one or two, I'll neglect to remember or mention another five or eight or 10
Right.
that
Right.
were good. But go back and look at our episode list and how many people we've brought in that have STEM backgrounds.
Yes.
They, in many cases, do have experience with gaming, which is what attracted them and interested
Yes.
them in joining us.
Yes.
But it just came to mind as we were talking before you hit record is that the podcast has really also become one where one of our forks of delivery is in the realm of some sort, the realm of scientific discussion, not research,
Hmm. Hmm.
anything like that. Interviewing people that are interesting, that come out of realms that honestly, for me, being in the business world,
Hmm.
um, I would normally never have the opportunity or the honor to meet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think
I'm
that's
with
what it
you.
was. It sounded better in my head when I first talked
No,
about
I
it.
think that
But
that was quite on point.
it's just it's funny how, and again, I don't want to make this sound like we're pivoting in any way because we're not. It's
No.
just um we've been able to bring in um some good
Well,
folks.
like next week. I mean, we're not going to give, and excuse me, next episode.
That was one that I was
Yeah,
thinking
we're
of
not going to
during
give
this.
anything away, but right now we're scheduled to have world-class scientist, another
Yeah,
one on the podcast to talk about his background, including his gaming background.
yeah.
We're very fortunate indeed.
I would say too, and this is just by, I think, sheer chance. Maybe not. Originally, it was by sheer chance.
Yeah,
Now, in some ways, we look for it because you have two daughters. I have
yes,
one.
yeah.
All three of them want to go into the sciences in some
Seems
form
that
or
way.
another,
Yeah, in some form or another, right?
some form or another. So I think it's funny how anytime either one of us sees um, women in STEM, um, we don't do it for any other reason than we love to see any time that that is advanced
Yeah.
because
Yes,
there's a need, and we have there are three girls between the two of us that we
that's
hope are
right.
successful.
Well, and women in leadership in general. I
Yes.
I
Oh,
was just
yes.
talking about this with one of my students who is a woman in leadership. And yes, I mean you and I feel very strongly. We did before we had
Mhm.
daughters, but this is so important to us, especially now. We're both better people and better men
Thank
because
you.
of it.
Yeah, I made it sound a little myopic that we
No, you
didn't
did
have
not.
any interest
No.
in.
No,
Well,
no,
we,
no,
we
you did
did have
not.
interest beforehand. It's been accentuated by the fact that we are seeing three young ladies grow up into a
Mhm,
realm where women in STEM
mhm.
is
Yeah.
needed.
All right,
So
so Ferrado on
I'm
Corey,
sorry, I completely
no,
hijacked
that
all of
was
it.
that was great. Good night, folks. No,
Yeah.
that was great.
I just got to ask before we wrap
Oh
up.
yeah.
Do you have anything on the desk that you haven't
Well,
told
so
me
I mean,
about?
I'm gonna just really bring it down,
Yeah, okay,
brow
that's
it
fine.
again.
Okay.
Um, so I'm looking at my desk. There's nothing on the desk literally at the moment. But I will say this. So the other day, it was I think it was 2 days ago. I had some time in the evening. Bits and pieces of quiet. So I brought up my copy. So, okay, so this was 2 or 3 days ago. I brought up my copy of Star Trek Adventures core rulebook. And I just read through bits and pieces to refresh myself because, like you had mentioned earlier, we haven't had as much time as I would like to play, but I find my thoughts gravitating back to I just want to roll. I just want to, the same stuff that got me
Mhm.
back into RPGs. And I want to make sure that I was still sharp around some of the rules and the mechanics, which we've really become taken with. And so it was really kind of a joy. Now I got all of them on an iPad upstairs, but I just wanted to have the core rulebook and
Yeah.
kind of read through again bits and pieces to confirm my understanding, and then to confirm, yep, this is how to roll, but also here are a couple things like initiative where I homebrew it. What has been on my mind, and I'll
I
close with
know you're
this.
going.
I know you do. I have thought daily about the second edition
Hmm.
Star Trek Adventures core rulebook daily since we first learned about it. Uh, and I mean, it's as this drops, it's only May. And the second edition will be available, quote, in the fall. And I'm thinking the fall probably won't be June, so it means I've
No,
got to
probably not.
wait. Probably
Probably
not.
not.
But I will. Okay, I'm going to say this because this will surprise you.
Yeah.
I hope. Otherwise, I'm going to have to rethink my choices in life.
Okay. If you
Um.
haven't done that by now, I'm surprised, but go ahead.
Oh, we haven't had that conversation yet.
Okay, good, good.
Um. So, so, I was going to say something stupid. I'll just save it for a few minutes later. Um. I am almost certain whenever that becomes available, so presumably fall, whenever the PDF becomes available, and we, obviously immediately pre-order, like
Oh
no
yeah.
brainer. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I've set aside cash intentionally for this book, like literally for this book, including shipping. It's just,
I've set aside something
yep.
too. I've set aside blankets so that I can sleep in my car after I tell Mrs. Brown that
You'll
I'm
come and
ordering this
visit and we'll
book.
do it
Yeah. Okay, that's
clandestinely.
a good
Right.
idea.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good idea. Um, I I will read the PDF probably cover to cover.
Oh, I would
I
bet you
never
would.
say again.
I would be shocked. I know we've talked about you and electronic books versus books. You just prefer books.
Yep,
This is one that if you
this is different.
wouldn't read it straight through, I'd be surprised.
Yeah, this one when it becomes available, uh the very, very little we know about it, it just sounds incredible. I'm very curious to see what happens. I have my hypotheses. I assume most will be wrong, but I want to see if it's especially with what they learned from Captain's Log. I want to see what they do with this second one. But I'm just gonna put it on the iPad and I'm just gonna read it. And
I'm
then when
gonna
the physical comes, I'll do it again.
I'm gonna speak for all of us who want second edition to say the number of pages in the book matters not. Put everything in there. I mean, look at the Pathfinder core rulebooks. I think you've got a record out there that you could potentially break. So so I would say, to the Modifius team, to Jim and everyone involved, no need to cut anything out. Just put it out there. Um, Proofreading optional. If you don't want to, you don't
Okay,
have to.
no,
But
no, definitely proofread. No, no, no. I mean, we've talked about this on and offline with Jim.
yes.
That's one of the places where Modifius stands out. And this is no disparagement to anyone else, but
No,
Modifius
no, no. So
stands
Green
out.
Ronin
And
does it too,
S
the way that
right,
both of those
right.
especially
When you
so.
have that level of line editing and proofreading and copy editing, it really shows. But I'm
Mhm.
going to push back a little bit because this is interesting. On the one hand, I'm totally with you. I mean, please, guys and gals and everyone, put in the kitchen sink.
600,
Oh,
600 pages,
I
easy.
would, I would not be opposed to that. However, flip side is if they and I think they will do a really good job. I mean, I have no
Oh, I
question.
have no doubt they
But
will.
if they do a really good job, like we know there are like rules, whatever, we don't know specifics, but we know that they're looking to to whatever the release information says, right? They're gonna, I mean, it's like everything they do. They'll iterate and they'll improve. But the reality is, especially under Jim Johnson, the original core rule book offers significant opportunity for refinement
Oh yeah. I mean,
in layout and in explanation of rule set, and honestly in certain areas that could be simplified. So while on the one hand I would love with you a 600-page second edition core rulebook, on the other hand, maybe more importantly, if they really do a bang up job, then it there might be more content, but it should not be longer.
I would say, put in any what you see as secondary or tertiary rules as options. Put in any optionals for those options as well.
Mhm.
And any and everything. Now, obviously, I'm being facetious. They're the ones because all these people play. Everyone is a Star Trek fan.
I mean, it's
The
it's our
the
asterisk of what the hell do we know?
Yeah, the
Right?
book that's going to come out is going
Gonna
to
be
be
insane.
exactly the book that we need.
Yeah, I think
And
you're right.
let's be quite honest, the supplements that'll come out after, I think Jim said it, you know, we will have, I think it's been out there, you can continue to use your
Hmm.
supplements
Oh yeah.
with it. So, but I would say, and maybe I'll post it out on Discord after this drops. My vote is for 600, I'm going to say 650-page core rule book. That's what I'm
Well,
going for.
regardless of length, because I think we would both agree length doesn't matter, and we're not pursuing that.
Well, there
I
goes the explicit flag.
no, it does not. Um,
Hey, but before you go, I wanted to mention because I've hijacked this whole thing. Um, this will have occurred after this releases, but you and I are going to be online tomorrow night watching a live presentation by our friends at Green Ronin.
yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I wish. I mean, it's just the recording schedule. I wish that we could have told people more about that early on. We'll have to
Yeah.
tweet out some stuff tomorrow
Yes.
night. We will make it a point. But yeah, we're both looking forward to that. We registered, I think, pretty much right away when we got the invitation.
Oh yeah, we did.
Um, that'll be that. I'm really looking forward to seeing Green Ronin's magazine.
Yeah.
Like we do see we got an email today, like kind of
Yes.
leading up. I'm really looking forward to the magazine. Um, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because we haven't talked enough lately about Green Ronin because I mean, my God, there are just so many games and we're talking to so many people. But
But we're
what a
going to
good
we've talked
man.
to our friend Troy there, and
Yeah, we're having them back.
we're going to have him back because we have much to talk about, not only with um, Fantasy Age Second Edition,
Yep.
um, but as well,
It's a good looking book,
yeah,
man.
Chris Paramus there sent out a really nice email, status update. I want to say a couple weeks back, talking about the status of some of the projects that were ongoing and um, where they struggled a bit over the past year and how they're getting everything
Oh,
going
okay.
again. And
I'm just gonna out myself. Will you send that to me?
yeah,
I
absolutely.
I just it's been like with it's been busy. That
Yeah.
one did not make my radar. Somehow I missed that, and I would like to read that.
Yeah, I will
Thank
send
you.
it to you as soon as we're
Uh,
done here. It is um oh, okay, never mind.
well,
Yeah, I will
so I
send
mean,
it
by
to
the
you.
time this drops, we will have already attended. We will have written about it. But this is just a friendly reminder that Green Ronin, again, another great group of people with first rate, first rate products.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, everyone, you know the deal. We always appreciate you listening and being with us on this journey of RPGs, real life, RPG lit, and wherever we wander. As always, be well, stay well. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.